Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace. Thank you everyone for attending today's congressional briefing hosted by CAIR, looking at the anti-Muslim bias in this current political moment. Anti-Muslim bigotry inside the United States and Europe has risen consistently over the last 2 decades, impacting media, politics, and culture. In fact, quantitative and qualitative research demonstrates that Islamophobia actually spikes during election cycles, I think as we've all witnessed so far this year. And it's now just become a part of the mainstream American political experience. This briefing is going to provide data, context, and analysis of how current levels of anti-Muslim bigotry fit in a larger historical frame of xenophobia and social discord, as well as provide guidance on best practices to mitigate and challenge what this poses to policymakers and their constituents. So in doing so, we're going to encourage audience members to ask questions after they've been debriefed by the Council on American Islamic Relations and our esteemed guests here today. I myself am just opening and facilitating this event. My name's Robert McCaw, and I'm the National Government Affairs Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations. So I've been with CAIR since 2011, and I have seen this steady change in political discourse about Muslims inside the United States and how they're framed and talked about. In 2012, when Michelle Bachmann attacked Huma Abedin, and with false conspiracy theories that while she was Hillary Clinton's aide, she was also some secret operative for a big boogeyman like the Muslim Brotherhood. We actually had Senate Republican leadership like John McCain denounce this. We had the RNC chair, Reince Priebus, actually denounce this type of speech. Moving on from 2012, we have just seen the steady rise of Islamophobia in our politics, how politicians freely and openly talk about Muslims in the United States, how they can be negatively framed at times, how that might even score you some political points in an election. In coinciding with this increased anti-Muslim rhetoric, we continue to see a rise in anti-Muslim bias incidents and hate crimes targeting American Muslims, which definitely impacts the community. I do want to make one note that while some in the American Muslim community, they shrink back when they experience Islamophobia in the media, in political discourse. We also see it ignite a fire in other Muslims, and they are encouraged to run for political office. So in 2018 alone, we've seen 100 Muslims or more at the local, state, and federal level run for elected office. Right now, in the 116th Congress, we're probably going to have 3 Muslim representatives in the U.S. House, with Representative Andre Carson being the senior Muslim in Congress. We're really excited about these developments. So it's not all bad news, and we have a great panel of guests here that are just going to talk about what are they seeing in this current political moment, what type of Islamophobia and challenges the Muslim community and all Americans, what are we collectively facing, but also how we can rise to that challenge, like those 100 other Muslims that ran for political office, that not only wanted to serve the Muslim community, but hopefully make America great for everyone. So with that, I'm going to hand over this briefing and forum to Dr. Abbas Barzegar. He is the Director of Research and Advocacy at the Council on American Islamic Relations. And please take it away, Dr. Abbas.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for everybody for joining us this morning. I understand that everybody's schedules are absolutely busy, and so for you to take the time out and join us, we really, really do appreciate it. I want to remind everybody to help yourself to coffee and a little bit of sweets if you like. You can feel free to do that now or anytime during the conversation. And also, if you haven't already, sign in, please. We'd love to be able to keep in touch with you. Again, my name is Dr. Abbas Barzegar. Up until about last month, I was a professor of comparative religion, where I researched transnational Muslim civil society at Georgia State University in Atlanta. But doing so much of that work and being sort of face-to-face with so many great community workers and folks that are doing political work, policy work, I just was quite tempted to come to this side of the party. And so I jumped over, and I'm now full-time in DC as the Director of Research at the Council. And like Robert said, today what we're trying to do is provide audience members some context, some history, and some sort of standard best practices about what's being done about Islamophobia, about anti-Muslim bias incidents, and more specifically, how that really affects our entire political climate. And so I'd like to briefly introduce the panel, and also let you know that we're trying to make this as comfortable as possible, as relaxed as possible, even though we've got this great barrier between us. What I'd like to do is run this as a moderated talk show style conversation, and what we're hoping to do is provide enough time towards the end of this conversation to invite everybody's participation, commentary, feedback, and give you some time to engage. So quickly, I'd like to introduce the panel. In the middle, we have Dr. John Esposito, professor at the Walsh School of Foreign Services, Georgetown University, an esteemed mentor and friend of all of ours in the academy that study Islam and comparative religion. He's the author of over 30 books, I believe, John, so we all sort of shrink in that capacity. Your most recent one is Sharia, What Everybody Needs to Know, is that correct? He's also the founding director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at the school, as well as the Bridge Initiative, which seeks to take head-on research and practice towards the problem of Islamophobia. To my right, we have Marita Etkubanez with Asian Americans Advancing Justice. She's the Director of Strategic Initiatives there, and her prior experience coming into this space is providing direct legal aid to marginalized communities, both in rural contexts and low-income contexts. And then to my far right, we have Zainab Arain, who is the manager in our Office of Research and Advocacy at the Council of American Islamic Relations. And prior to coming, to me showing up, I arrived and I said, okay, what's the workflow look like? What's going on here? And Zainab says, well, for the last 3 months I've been doing, this, and this kind of research. And when I looked into the databases and I looked what she was doing, she's got these amazing Excel sheets, and she's done so much direct research on the Islamophobia network and on the funding industry that is fueling so much of what we see on the grassroots level and the political levels and the media levels, and I'm just absolutely privileged to walk into such an environment. So thank you, Zainab, for the work that you've been doing. I'd like to go ahead and jump right in, and I'm going to start with Dr. Esposito, and my hope is through the conversation is to kind of give us a broad overview, and then kind of wind down into the specifics into our current moment. And so, John, there's very few people that have the perspective that you do on this phenomenon. And if you could take us back to sort of where do you think the relationship between American political cycles, political climate, and Islamophobia became so wedded, so fused? You always tell us that when you started your job, people thought this Islam thing was some marginal religion on the other side of the planet, and now it's front stage in everybody's mind. So could you provide us a little bit of context of politics and Islamophobia?
Yeah, I'll be very brief on. I'll be very brief on the background. In the 1990s, I wrote a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. And we did the second edition, which would have been the late 1990s. I had a section on Islamophobia, which existed here, if you actually looked at some of the media stories and the way they were framed, but was fairly invisible. Islamophobia was actually developing far more in Europe, and in fact, the very term came out of the UK. But for American engagement and realization of what Islamophobia is like, I would just cite 2010, the so-called Mosque at Ground Zero. CNN at that time asked me to go to New York, spend an hour or two being recorded, and then they were splitting this into like 6 or 8 shows. But what was interesting to me was that during the break, both the producer, who was a very, very sharp woman, and the person who was the talking head with me, kept saying, what is this? We don't know what this is. Where did this come from? Okay? And I said, it's the tip of the iceberg. But nobody realizes that there was the iceberg. And the way you could see it was that for the first time, that event generated a major magazine having its cover page say, is America Islamophobic? It's the first time that we had that kind of coverage in a major magazine. It was Time magazine. right after that, and you don't want to downplay it, you had literally a kind of tsunami wave which both hit mosques, that is, problems building mosques, violence against mosques across the United States. And you then had the so-called creeping Sharia phenomenon that was developed, and developed specifically, not responding to an issue, but in fact fabricating an issue. If you look at this book that we do at OUP on Sharia, the person who generated it actually sort of said, you know, he was just writing on this. But in fact, what it led to is an incredible number of states, and some of you have heard this, who have attempted, Oklahoma was the first one, to block the implementation of Sharia. Now, the joke of it is, nobody was talking about implementing Sharia. You didn't have a single Muslim attempting to do this, going to a state. You didn't have any movement, but it just took off. And you had state after state attempting to do this. And then after a while, they realized that some of the courts were throwing that out, so then it became to block foreign laws. But they're really aiming for Sharia. It's like today, if you want to have a law to prevent women from wearing the hijab, the best thing is to look good and clean about it, is to say that no religious symbols, can be worn, by anybody. But that's when it really began to grab, and you began to see headlines, and you began to see people playing up situations that occurred before. It begins to peak in particular when you look at the elections, the Obama elections. Some of you can remember the story of Obama being in Dearborn, going to take a picture, and his people trying to, in a nice way, move the young ladies that had a hijab to the side so he wouldn't be seen. The fact that Obama, as president, went to a mosque in Cairo, went to one in Indonesia, and waited until the end of his second term to appear at a mosque in the United States, says something. I have been waiting for Obama to go on a late night show, and when they say, Mr. President, what's it really like today? Tell us about what you're doing. That he would start with Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I just thought that would really screw these people who all the time were creating these incredible, fabricated kinds of stories. And what we began to see more and more was that there was a kind of robust presence in the United States, but we also see it in the UK. What's happening now is that because of a variety of factors, okay, the rise of white nationalism, feeds in certain white nationalist groups, both in Europe and America, feeds an anti-immigrant and therefore also anti-Muslim type folk. So when you look at the number of outfits that deal with this, you have outfits that are clearly Islamophobic in their intent. Jihad in America. In other words, the very title says something. But Pajama Media sounds American Thinker, Family Security. They just sound like normal kinds of places. And that's where you get that kind of broad impact. It used to be that it was mass media that drove things. If they made a story, then it would go to social media. It's now just the reverse. A few years ago, I and four Muslim speakers were speaking in Texas. And Pamela Geller got on and called upon her tribe in the United States to descend on where we were. That then triggered the O'Reilly show sending somebody down. Years before would have been just the opposite. Okay? So, and a significant number of the folks we're talking about are people who, when they're not watching something like Fox News, are on the internet dealing with these sites. So I think that that level of influence, just to very briefly bring it to an end and give you something quantitative to think about. There's a group called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. You can go up on their website and see it. They're based in Europe. They monitor media 365 days a year?
I forgot.
I can't remember. It's 365 days a year, okay? They looked at 978,000 pieces of media between 2001 and 2011, 978,000 pieces of media, and said, where is Islam and Muslims here? What does the coverage look like? 2001, it was 2% of the coverage on extremism, 0.1% on what the vast majority of Muslims are like, what they're doing, etc. 2011, the 2% jumps to 25%, and the other side remains at 0.1%. By 2015, 2016, the head of the firm could literally do a headline when he did the report for that year. It was something like, Islamophobia is here to stay. Okay? And what they discovered in 2015, 2016 was that 8 out of 10 stories in Europe, when they were looking at it, 8 out of 10 were negative. When they looked at the US, UK, and Germany, it was 9 out of 10. And when they looked at mainstream coverage, there was still a tint to the mainstream coverage. When they then looked at, well, what Muslims are featured, are they, that there's a Nobel laureate or whatever? No, it was warlords and terrorists. So it's that kind of phenomenon that really has the impact. And some of you have had the experience, but all you've got to do is get out there with ordinary people. Because the thing about Islamophobia is you have people who are, from my point of view, card-carrying bigots. Okay? And either deliberate, for some of them it's their job, for some of them it's but for a lot of Americans, they can be anti-Muslim simply because they watch media. Depending on the media, it seems logical. These are people we should be afraid of. Now, this has all gotten juiced up because of the last, the elections with Obama, but particularly the 2 times that he ran, when Republicans in particular came forward and raised these issues. Republicans like Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, etc. But you see it in the last election in spades when you have a presidential candidate who says Islam hates us. I mean, what you're being given, this is the gift that keeps on giving. So from my point of view, I can get upset about it, but actually I thank God that this gift keeps on giving because it forces people to realize what we really have here. A person's really bringing out who they are, so that when they're then asked and given an opportunity to qualify that, do you mean a lot of Muslims are? That, no, Islam hates us. Then you go to the Muslim ban, and you deal with them, the response, and similar things happen in Europe, the response and the fallout when it comes to the issue of refugees. So, we're talking about something that's very powerful. We're talking about something where if you go to our website, it's bridge.georgetown.edu. I don't have a chance to go through the data. Bridge.georgetown.edu. Take a look at our fact sheets. Our fact sheets on this presidency, members of the cabinet, and advisors in the government, and their past relationships. How they think about Islam. Do they see it as a religion or just as a dangerous political ideology, which many of them do and have said that in spades. Who did they work with before? Did they work for somebody like Horowitz, who has a long track record in this kind of negative approach? And then you get a sense of really where we are. When our Secretary of State gets celebrated by Act for America with a special celebration and award because there have been connections, that's troublesome. Because Act for America says not all Muslims are terrorists, but actually, if you're a devout Muslim and you pray 5 times a day and you're serious about your faith, you're more prone to becoming a terrorist. So anyway, I'll end there.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I'm going to jump right into Maritza, if you don't mind. Bringing it down one level, you do concrete work, advocacy work for an organization across the country. We know that any form of bigotry in the United States is a threat to everybody. It's a problem in our social fabric, and it's going to impact our political climate one way or the other. From your perspective, from the grassroots organization's perspective, how are you seeing anti-Muslim bias manifesting itself in your day-to-day work and your organization's work?
Thank you. Yes. First, thank you very much for including me in this briefing. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Maritza Ecubanez, and I work with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. So we are the DC office of a larger affiliation, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which is dedicated to advocating and promoting the civil rights of Asian Americans and all Americans. So we have affiliates in San Francisco. The Asian Law Caucus is our oldest affiliate. Los Angeles, Chicago, the DC office, and now also an affiliate in Atlanta. And I would say that all of our organizations have slightly different focus, but collectively we all work on advocacy, whether at the federal, state, or local level, both in terms of advancing legislation and working with government agencies. We An important part of our work is community outreach and education, so know your rights presentations, and we also engage in litigation. So part of that involves representing individuals who need assistance, but also engaging in impact litigation to try to address systems that are flawed and harmful to and where there's harm to our communities. And so I would say that, I mean, clearly these issues impact our work in all of those ways, right? And our different affiliates, and I can get into this in more detail, they're providing individual representation to folks who need help. They are constantly out there doing Know Your Rights presentations. And we are doing what we can to advocate both with agencies and in terms of trying to advance legislation. And much of our work is done in coalition with other groups, so we are very pleased to be working in partnership with CAIR, other organizations, including those that are involved with the broader Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, which is also where we work with a lot of our partners on different anti-hate initiatives. So we're seeing this in all different parts of the country, trying to work in all the different avenues that we are engaged. And I would say another piece, because our 5 affiliates are all based in urban areas, we know there are large swaths of the country where we are not present. We actually have a network of many community-based organizations throughout the country that work with us to feed us information about what's happening on the ground, and we do what we can to be responsive to their needs, both in terms of providing tools for advocacy, keeping them abreast of what's happening on different issues here in Washington, D.C., and really we just hope that that's a good loop and partnership with the many community-based organizations that we work with.
Thank you, Marita. If I could drill down just a little bit, I can say from personal experience that in Atlanta, your chapter there has actually been one of the most vocal and sort of leaders in the community, especially around when the first Muslim ban came into place, and all across the country we saw people going to airports and protesting. Your organization was spearheading that movement in Atlanta. Is there a pattern or a particular set of issues that you're encountering, your office is encountering, vis-a-vis Muslim issues? For example, we know that Sikhs often get targeted as being Muslims, and that's been happening since the Iranian Revolution. Do you see patterns of how this is spilling over into other communities, or anything more you can tell us about kind of sort of concrete problems that folks are facing on the ground?
Yes, thank you. And yes, the Muslim ban, our colleagues across the affiliates were at the airports, obviously working on that. We also tried to mobilize people, not just to, well, we engaged in the litigation to attack the Muslim ban, but we also tried to mobilize visible demonstrations of our community rising up in opposition. So we organized a rally and took people down to Richmond when the Fourth Circuit heard that case. And we met a lot of advocates from the Richmond area who thanked us for coming down when really we recognize that this is an issue that impacts us all. Our affiliate in the Bay Area, the Asian Law Caucus, has a dedicated national security and civil rights project where, again, they are out there constantly doing Know Your Rights presentations, and they have been representing individuals who have been directly impacted by the Muslim ban, right? Who want to bring families here, who have been halted in their immigration processes, and they are working through legal channels to try to address that, although there are not clear legal channels at the moment. So they're using what's available to them to submit waiver requests and different things, but we know that they're hitting different roadblocks there. So we're continuing to try to work different avenues within the legal system. And also our Los Angeles affiliate is working closely with many groups on the ground there, and they actually have been successful in a campaign of mobilization to have the city of Los Angeles withdraw from the Countering Violent Extremism program and to actually reject federal funding that they had applied for and received. And that was the result of much work, mobilization with many groups. And yeah, I mean, that is one small victory that we can claim.
Absolutely. Actually, if I could just elaborate on that. For many of you in your offices, I don't know if you're familiar with CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. If you're not, it's a very important policy framework that's got a funding channel housed in the Department of Homeland Security. However, as a policy agenda item, it really spans the entire federal government, and it is now sort of bled over into a global governance issue. Countering violent extremism is sort of seen as an extension of counterterrorism efforts. The idea is some people are going to become terrorists. How do we stop that from happening? How do we prevent that from happening? And if there are terrorists doing messaging, how do we counter that sort of ideology? Now, the problem with that is that you have to presume that a certain kind of person is going to become a terrorist. And if you define terrorist in a very exclusive way, your options and your checklist of who's going to become a terrorist somehow in this policy world and in the media world and in the political environment somehow get narrowed down very, very quickly to being young Muslims. And oftentimes young Muslims in the United States in different parts. Well, who is going to look into that? School teachers, counselors, etc. But effectively what happens is that there is a very aggressive securitization and deputization of our entire civil society space. It's a very, very dangerous precedent. It's something that people are grappling with all across the globe, actually, this policy item. And to echo what Marita just said, in Los Angeles, we have a case where a municipality was forced effectively through political challenges and through broad civil society coalition level support by organizations like CAIR, Asian American Advancing Justice, the ACLU, to put enough pressure on the mayor's office to reject a Department of Homeland Security grant that would have effectively done much of this work. Those kind of victories are precisely the things that we need to study, we need to document, we need to monitor and express, and we need to inform staff members in Congress as well as policy advocates around the country on how best to mitigate these things and still address very serious issues that are out there. Nobody's denying that we do have security concerns. The question is, what kind of solution is it that you're offering? So we'd be happy to take questions about that. I did some research on that for the last few years, and so I know a thing or two about that. Happy to answer any more questions about countering violent extremism if needed. Moving on now to my esteemed colleague Zainab. Zainab, if you don't mind, could you take us even further down into the data, into what you see? You live in spreadsheets and reports and monitoring systems. What are you seeing over the last couple of years since you've been at CAIR and you've had your hand on the steering wheel on Islamophobia monitoring?
Sure, so there's two main things that I've been doing research on, and one is anti-Muslim bias incidents over the past few years, and then I've also been doing research into the anti-Muslim network in the United States. So I'm going to start with the bias incidents and then draw it to the network. So there's a report right here many of you may have grabbed that covers anti-Muslim bias incidents in 2017, and it shows a tremendous spike in both anti-Muslim bias incidents and hate crimes in the past year. And if we look from 2014 to 2017, bias incidents have jumped 94%, and specifically hate crimes in that 4-year period, 3-4-year period, have jumped 689%. So not only is there an increasing number of incidents targeting American Muslims, but there's also the incidents themselves are increasingly violent, which includes the desecration of mosques, people being individually targeted with like physical attacks, and so that is a tangible effect of the anti-Muslim rhetoric that Dr. Esposito mentioned in the media and political rhetoric that we've seen espoused by various politicians. Particularly of concern in the past year has been the rise in government agency-instigated incidents. So we've seen that the FBI, CBP, ICE, TSA, all of these agencies constituted nearly a third of all anti-Muslim bias incidents in the last year. And this year, we've seen the same trend throughout the first 3 quarters. Every quarter, and on average from January through September, we've seen that government agencies are responsible for a third of all anti-Muslim incidents. So this can be like inappropriate questioning at the border about what mosque do you attend and what is your specific religious sect. Basically questioning that is not needed when you're coming into the country as a citizen. and FBI going to American Muslims' homes and asking them again, like, who do you know? Which mosque do you attend? So basically very improper and inappropriate questioning targeting of the American Muslim community. And then the fact that anti-Muslim bias incidents perpetrated by government agencies has increased ties in well with, unfortunately, the fact that there is an increasing number of anti-Muslim bigots who are now part of the administration and who are able to sort of push those policies. So in the current administration, we have almost more than a dozen individuals who have connections with organized anti-Muslim groups. So if we take the Muslim ban as sort of like a case study of looking at a few of these linkages, we see that when President Trump himself made the initial announcement for the Muslim ban in late 2015, he cited a poll conducted by CSP, which is an anti-Muslim think tank, and the poll was statistically inaccurate, completely a junk poll, as Georgetown verified. And that poll was conducted by the polling company, which was then run by Kellyanne Conway, who is now counselor to the president. So there's one linkage there. Another linkage is that the Muslim ban itself was initially drafted by Bannon and Stephen Miller. And Stephen Miller has a close relationship with the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which is also a very large anti-Muslim group that has facets like media facets, it has political engagements across basically a wide spectrum of society. And so it's interesting and kind of disturbing to see the trend of both increasing anti-Muslim bias and increasing institutionalization of Islamophobia within the government.
Thank you, Zainab. And one of the real goals of forums like this and the reporting that we do is to educate, especially staffers like yourselves and advocates in the community about these funding channels, about these networks, so that we don't assume somehow that bigotry is just some kind of problem in the weather, that it just is made up out of thin air and it's nothing and something that we just can't control and that we all just hope it would go away or we just pray that it'll change. But instead to understand that there is a cause and effect sequence of events here, and that we can actually map that, we can identify those things, and for your own constituents, your own voters in your districts, many of the victims of this political climate and those people that are directly affected, whether Muslim or look like Muslim or sound like Muslim or are concerned citizens about the political climate, many of your voters are looking for solutions to mitigate this problem. They're looking for a healthier social environment, a healthier political environment. And so our reporting happens on two levels. We have a civil rights report that monitors the numbers, the incidents that happen on a regular basis to keep track. We do that quarterly. We actually just published our third quarterly results. You can grab a copy on your way out. We also have copies of our 2017 Civil Rights Report. And in January, we'll be producing our Islamophobia report. Comes out every 2 years that really does map out these funding channels and these political connections so that everybody can be properly educated. Before I go to the audience, one, I wanted to give a chance to the members of the panel to respond to anything that the others brought up. I don't know if you want to ask each other questions. Oftentimes we never get to do that as panelists. Is there anything that you'd like to ask one another?
I would just feed what's been said here with the fact that we know from several studies that have been done by the Center for American Progress, by CAIR and others, that hundreds of millions of dollars have been funneled into these organizations and websites. And this is based on tax returns, IRS tax returns. So we're talking about an enormous amount of money. And there is nothing, as it were, on the other side, that has anything like that. The bridge project that I've been running for a number of years has a fairly robust operation, but that means that there are, 6, 8 of us? And we probably have more people on that than any Islamophobia, outfit in the United States. So we're talking an enormous amount of funding and what you can do with that kind of with that kind of funding. The other thing too is that I think it's important to go to websites of the organizations, and that's why I mentioned Bridge. I always forget to mention it because the organizations have all kinds of information there that when we give you this short talk, you wouldn't know, but also you might be sitting there thinking, well, how do we know? What's this based on? You know, and it's based on research, and when you go, you can see, you know, the actual research, you know, that is there. Looking at government agencies and what do they do or not do, and what do they admit that they do or they don't do, for example. And looking at specific players, you know. I mean, people forget that when somebody like Newt Gingrich says, we ought to ask Muslims, he started with Sharia, getting the federal law. But then it became, in this last iteration, we ought to ask a Muslim if they follow Sharia, and if they do, they should be deported. Well, that means that anybody who prays 5 times a day should be deported. I mean, there's a level of ignorance there. And if you can ever find this, Rick Santorum spoke at a college. After he spoke, 3 Muslim students came up with their iPhones as he was drinking his coffee and asked him questions about Islam, Sharia. You know, in other words, what do you know about? He had nothing to say. He just kept sipping his coffee. So he knows it's bad. He knows he makes speeches and gets paid to do it. He's kept his career half alive because of that. But it's like whether you're dealing with him or you're dealing with Newt Gingrich. What makes that dangerous is that their equivalents are in Congress. You know, one might look and say, well, they're not. But the fact is we have people that have power and have a clue about what they're believing and what they're doing. And some of them are racist or whatever. Others are not. They're simply people that the fear factor has gotten to, and given the data that they're being handed, it looks like, well, you know, we need to protect ourselves.
Sam, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just like to add to what Dr. Esposito said about the funding and sort of the methods of collection. So he mentioned that, you know, much of the funding information has been collected from tax returns and, you know, IRS records, which is something I feel like we should, you know, work together to optimize our, like, you know, data collection processes. And so the Islamophobia report that Dr. Barzegar mentioned we're releasing in January, I'm not fully complete in sort of looking through the data, but as of yet, over the past few years, we've seen that the anti-Muslim network has access to more than $1 billion in revenue. And that's like staggering amounts of money to push forward an agenda that is targeting a very particular religious group in the country. So that's just what I wanted to add.
You know, it's 11:40. We have the room till 12:30, but we wanted to wrap up right around noon, maybe 5 afternoon, since we got started about 5 minutes late, and also give us. Go ahead.
There's a second edition of a book coming out. It's called Missing Martyrs. Missing Martyrs, and the book actually was done with the idea of there are so many, you know, domestic Muslims who are martyrs and committing these actions and are going. And the first edition showed how small that number was as compared to the extremist groups that we have, the white nationalists, etc., and what they're doing. And now the second edition is coming out. And that kind of stuff's important because you have hard data that will show the great exaggerations. You know? On the other hand, I don't know that this is still the same case, but a number of years ago, we tried to check out the IRS returns, the salary of one of the people whose names has been named here. And I would swear that probably half the people in Congress would resign if they felt that they could get the kind of salary that this guy has to do.
Zainab's got their bank accounts, huh?
Yeah, I applied for the job, I couldn't get it.
No, actually, I just echo that. Missing Martyrs by Charles Kurzman, I believe is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And just so that everybody recognizes where the scholars and advocates are on this position, Charles Kurzman was on the campus when a domestic sort of mentally disturbed individual of Iranian American background drove a Jeep across campus trying to kill people. All right, and he starts his book off that way. There is nobody in this space that is blind to the problem of, you know, let's say, you know, whatever you want to call it, radicalization, extremism, terrorism. Those are real things in the world. It is the question about how we manage that information, those inputs, and deal with it as a national community that is the concern of most of the people in this space. And I say that because, for example, I've got a neighbor down in Atlanta. His name is Phil. retired fellow in his 60s. His lawn is perfect, okay? It drives me crazy, right? His lawn is always perfect. And he came over for tea one day, and he looked at us, and my wife is in international media, and we were just sort of talking about our career interests and what we do. And he looked at me in a very honest moment. He said, I have a grandchild, 5 years old, and I don't know how I'm going to leave this world to him with ISIS. And when he talked about ISIS, he had fear in his eyes. And he said, I don't understand the world. Now, statistically, Americans face a much greater threat from Mexican drug cartels, actually impacting the communities that they live in, than ISIS. Okay, and we can document that very clearly with drug trafficking, certain kinds of organized crime, syndicates, violence, etc. There is a much larger threat from certain kinds of criminal activity in this country that will affect you physically than ISIS ever will. But somehow, the fear factor is real for people. And that reality, that perceived reality, has affected and propelled a certain kind of narrative. Our job here is to not try to say that, ISIS doesn't exist and this problem doesn't exist. The question is, how do we frame this responsibly as a national community? So with that, I just want to throw the court open a little bit and make sure that people in the audience have a chance to ask some questions. And I don't want to be the one who picks folks. So Robert, if you don't mind, maybe if we can see a show of hands and
Sure.
and take a cue.
First hand here, if you just state your name, office, and ask your question.
Great. I'm Yusra Mazi with American Invisible. Thank you all for your remarks. I was struck by something that Dr. Esposito, you shared about Newt Gingrich and his anti-Muslim statements. I read in a couple places that Newt Gingrich has been given credit for finding space within the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, for Muslims who work in the Capitol building to pray during Friday prayers historically, like many years ago when they started praying in the building. And so I wonder if you can, as a collective, speak to what advice do you have on raising the accountability of, politicians or people in government who may have, on the record or in their day-to-day, done things to accommodate minority communities like Muslim Americans, and then when it comes to electoral cycles, are publicly speaking against these very groups that they may have been acting as allies towards. And in different ways, you've talked about some of these funding cycles and the media pollution that perpetuates anti-Muslim biases. I wonder, especially from the experience of Asian Americans, Japanese Americans who suffered through internment here in the United States and being otherized, what lessons can we learn about systematic ways at addressing this, either the funding or growing accountability of our public officials to address this, in addition to the in-the-moment litigation, research, and advocacy that you all do?
We are at an interesting potential turning point in terms of social change and social policy. I mean, one of the things that struck me with the Muslim ban situation was that at a number of airports, the people who came, who were they, their backgrounds? And often they were people who were not Muslim. They were people that might have been involved in, Me Too, that were involved in all kinds of NGOs that realized, this is an American problem, okay? And I think that that has to be the approach that from now on, that when we deal with racism, it should be, across the board racism, because that threatens all of society. And I think that also we have a situation where people are getting outed for a lot of what they've done. Well, they should be outed. There should be ways in which you look at the background of people. I mean, I have a number of friends who are Republican Muslims. I pray for them every day, but they're adamant. But the reality of it is, one of them said to me one time that there were a particular hearing being held by a member of Congress from New York, who always says that before 9/11 he was very close to the Muslim community, but then that changed. And this person said to me, he said, when he holds these panels, funding comes in the next day, things go up. And you remember with Ben Carson, when his people were advising him to back off, and he didn't, and then they discovered the next day, after he made a hard statement with regard to Muslims, it went up. So I think what's going to take is really kind of coalition responses, not just a single organization. And I think that that's a very effective way if we did more and more of that, for example, in dealing, if you take Congress.
Well, that's an example, sorry, that's just an example of how easy it is to do coalition-based research, documentation, right? So when we see a media incident from a politician, is there a way to do research with open records that show funding spikes? And to show that pattern consistently, and if we can, create some sort of monitoring system there, that's a very simple thing to show that this is a manufactured problem.
And I would thank you for the question. I would add, yes, many organizations are regularly involved in, for lack of a better term, calling out harmful political rhetoric, right? We have many allies that do that. And in terms of, I agree, it's an interesting moment, and I will say that when we do speak out, we have many allies, right? So obviously there are people on the other side, but I'd say we've seen pretty much a near universal condemnation of these sorts of sentiments, and many people step out. Like we've seen statements from many of the ethnic bar associations, which that's a group that people listen to, right? SALT, Sikh Coalition, and in terms of the Muslim ban, many civil rights organizations stepped out on that, and I would say that one of the really powerful voices has been the Japanese American Citizens League, right? They obviously understand the context this is in, and those are really important voices. And so when they speak out like this happened to us, we want to make sure this happens to no one else. I mean, those are voices that are heard.
All right, great. I would just add, speaking of Gingrich, in 1996 he put out a very famous list on how Republican candidates could characterize their political opposition. So while Gingrich opened up a room for prayer for Muslim staff that still continues, Gingrich, I bet if he made that list today, he might add Sharia to it. Because we just saw with Congressman Duncan Hunter, in his campaign, he labeled his opponent, who's a Christian, Kampa Najjar, as an Islamist who's trying to infiltrate Congress. This type of rhetoric actually works for some people in some races. It's been widely condemned. We actually saw in 2 cases where this type of rhetoric backfired, though. So in Corey Stewart's campaign, a candidate running in Virginia for senator for the U.S. Senate, he has a campaign Twitter account. And that account kind of went on an attack on Abdul Saeed, who, Michigan, right?
Michigan.
It was a Michigan candidate for governor. He got like 200 or 300,000 votes, maybe next time. But he made false allegations and derogatory remarks about him. Corey Stewart, after getting one-on-one pressure from the Muslim community, actually said, look, I actually didn't issue that tweet. That was from the campaign team that was doing it. I reject this type of language. Or just 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, John Grasso, who's a local Maryland councilman running for state senate, he posted a number of inflammatory remarks about Islam, reposting things on his Facebook page. They're derogatory, I don't want to repeat them. But CAIR called him out, and he actually doubled down on it. But Larry Hogan, who's the state's Republican governor, actually said, I don't endorse that type of language, and I wouldn't actually endorse Grasso. Grasso was forced to apologize. This only happens when you have Muslim community support, but in Grasso's apology, he actually text messaged a local Muslim who is from his city council district, and he said, these aren't my remarks, that I don't stand by these remarks, I apologize. It's these local connections. So I bet Gingrich, actually on a one-on-one basis, he has good relations with Muslims, for those that want to identify and work with him still. But I think it's a political strategy. And actually the guy who was running Corey Stewart's Twitter account, he was a former campaign aide to Roy Moore. And he also pushed that type of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim political campaign rhetoric because they think it works. So the only time we can really defeat this type of language in the political moment is when you have authentic community members who have connections, and it was community members that were connected to Corey Stewart, or who John Grasso knew he could reach out to. These are the ones that gave them the option to back out of this corner they found themselves in when they thought employing Islamophobic rhetoric in a campaign might be beneficial to them. So, next awesome question.
It's a comment to your original question and agreeing with the points you all have shared. Thank you. Thank you. Very timely panel. But don't be confused with someone extending a courtesy, like reserving a room, with what hard policy steps or votes are taken.
Sure.
And I will go back to former speaker. You mentioned an incident in '96. In January 1995, my third year on the Hill, his very first action as speaker was to change the rules of the House to abolish what was then LSOs, Legislative Service Organizations, which included the Congressional Black Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, the Asian American CAIR had not formally organized, but he abolished them. And members got very creative and shifted from a separate organization with separate office space and funding to a CMO, Congressional Member Organization, which is sort of what functions now. But that was a hard, definitive policy that told us who he was at that point. And so in the legislative branch, the same people don't make the same votes all the time you need in the House 218. So you want to be able to work with people. Even the gentleman from Long Island sometimes can be an ally on a particular issue. But you've got to be informed about the data, the facts, the policies, so that you can either refute them, work around them, or open up.
Very relevant. There's a question right there.
Yes, hi, I'm from Jamie Raskin's office. With the rise in seemingly social acceptance of the white nationalist movement, how do you suppose we get homogenous communities to care about injustices towards Muslim people, Jewish people, people of color in general?
I'll just kick off a very quick response. Malcolm X once recounted in his a talk he gave that when he lived in the South, people were very forward and frontward with their bigotry, and he could know who his enemies were. But when he moved to Massachusetts, everyone smiled, but he couldn't really tell what their true nature and intent was. So I would actually say, as much as I have a disdain for Islamophobia and its rise, it's actually given us a moment right now to have open conversations like these and to confront it and to put it back where it belongs, on the margins of society. I think with white nationalism, whether it's white power or it comes in forms of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or anti-black racism, we can use this moment as an opportunity, like a PSA, to remind people unacceptable. And so that's part of what I enjoy about working at CAIR, is I can, if a politician makes a really nasty statement about my community or another community, I want to drag them through the mud. I want them to have a cloud over them and have people always remember this is what they said and it was unacceptable. And maybe the next time someone's considering like speech or actions, they can realize, oh, that's not good. I'll open up to Pam.
Well, there's also, if you take a look, there are organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, and quite a few organizations, where that information, can be garnered and then be used. I think, when you get into these very sensitive topics, you really do need to be going to outfits that have research on attitudes and behaviors so that you can really cite it. Because without that, forget it. In my wife's experience and my experience, we have friends in 3 different states, very close friends, in Florida, here, and New York. And there are friends who send us these god-awful letters, saying, gee, could you help us with this? They are only half saying that, because when you then fact-check it, you get back, oh, that's probably a Democratic fact-check outfit. But the reality of it is, people need to hear about the concrete things that have happened, the concrete cases, the concrete data that we have. For background, you ought to take a look at, just a quick read, sections of it, David Cole's book, Less Safe, Less Free. David Cole is Georgetown law professor. He's now with UCLA, with ACLU for a couple of years. But David did a book, The First Reactions After 9/11. And the stats on the thousands of people that were arrested and vetted, and nobody found guilty of that. When you build a case from that, you see, and then move it forward, then people begin to realize, where we are. I just read a piece coming over here. I'll send it to you, and maybe you can circulate it. We have somebody on our staff that looks at Europe and America and what's going on. But something dealing with homeland security and how they new approaches to profiling. And basically, when really pressed, the response is, well, at the end of the day, it's that they seem threatening. See, but if you can press on that so that there's like no data, then what does that mean, seem threatening? Or in a situation I was in, we had a situation where a member of this, a staff member in Congress, talked about the fact that his father was on a list, no-fly list. And sort of, just commented and said, and he'll never get off it. And the guy worked for the very agency that his father was on, So, getting some of this stuff out in terms of, really the hard data out there, So it gets beyond the accusations that are just made, on social media or on Fox, or knowing that, for example, a study of Fox for 2016 found that it was 100% negative. Unlike the past where they got a little positive stuff, or more objective stuff. But I think really building up a little bit of a war chest of that kind of data when one makes a case on something.
I would also add, maybe push back a little bit, that the data, the facts, and the information are important to sort of close the case when you have at least a crack of an audience listening, right? If you've got a little bit of an audience opening, then the facts really are helpful. The data is helpful to show the relationship between these ideas and things like that. But I fundamentally believe that that the mass body of people that we are assuming to be Islamophobic or the audience of Islamophobes, that they're motivated by fear and ignorance in a very innocent way, I will say. I'm not quick to call out everybody that might be the audience of these programs and sort of the targeted audience of the Islamophobia network. I would not be the first to call them out and say that they're just bigots. I believe that most of them, my neighbors in Atlanta and the broad swath of community members, are fundamentally misfed information, and not just information, but an entire framework of what they're afraid of, and they associate Muslims with an existential threat, and it has been framed that way. And until you can break that frame, you're not going to have the crack opening to provide the data. And the way that statistics have actually shown us, some of the work that your mentee Dalia has done for us, Dalia McCaw with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, some of that work has shown consistently that that if somebody has met a Muslim, right? If somebody has met a Muslim and met people, so to break out of these homogenous circles, you've actually met somebody, your chances of subscribing to this set of beliefs goes dramatically down. So it is actually the grassroots activity, the interfaith coalitions, the grassroots coalitions that are in your districts, that are in your, in your community districts, that actually make quite a difference. And if they see leadership from congressional representatives and from staffers and policymakers to build social cohesion across faith lines, across ethnic lines, if those audiences see that, they know better. They know what America is supposed to stand for. And I don't believe anybody's comfortable with the level of social polarization that's happening. So I would encourage you as staffers to be involved in listening towards and be involved in those kind of community town halls. And your constituents will come out more and you'll see their true colors.
As congressional staffers, you also could have noticed, and most people didn't, not this year, but last year, when they had the hearings on the Muslim Brotherhood. the hearing literally took a couple of minutes because you could hear the introduction by a congressperson, which was biased. Then his colleague, who comes from a state that I vote in, was ignorant and talked about, what we say to our close ally, General CC, and all this other stuff. When the Democrats went to respond, and they had asked me to do the background for the Democrats, they never even touched it, because what they raised was the procedure. They said, whenever we have hearings, we always have somebody from state, CIA, government agencies, we have none of that today. And so what they were arguing is we need to redo this and have a proper, to which the chair calls for a vote. And they voted along party lines, and that was it. Okay. Now, to me, that is an incredible situation. I mean, there wasn't even an attempt to fake something, but really to just move on that, move on that vote and not have any. And the reason they didn't want to do it is because if you really go into many of our agencies, we've got great analysts, who would be coming out and questioning, what's done, and that lays the groundwork for them to do it again this year, and continue that way.
That's great. Do we have one last question? And then we can mingle a little bit afterwards. We'll stick around, drink coffee, right back there.
Hi, I'm Insof. I'm with Congresswoman Lawrence's office. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on CVE, on how it affects or legitimizes Islamophobia and how it affects communities of Muslims, especially with Black Muslims who face the intersection of racism and Islamophobia, especially with regards to policing.
Great.
Did you say predictable policing
Or just policing?
Just policing in general? Okay, because there's something there about artificial intelligence and what they call predictive policing policies now. I'm going to take a second on this, if you don't mind, right? And I'll say this because prior to coming to CAIR, when I was at Georgia State University, we partnered with the British Council, which is a kind of cultural affairs department here, civil society office here out of the British Embassy. It's part of the British Foreign Office. And we surveyed the impact of what is called counter or preventing violent extremism policies in the transnational space, both on Muslim communities as well as other communities that are dealing with violence, problems of violence. So this included things like so-called, called street organizations or gangs, right, and gang violence. And we were basically monitoring and asking what kind of things constitute best practices in this space, and what are obstacles for municipalities and community-based organizations to deal with these problems of violence. So CVE is that broad framework that President Obama actually instituted, and it was intended to be, let's work with the community. Let's work with the community to address the growing problem of violent extremism writ large. Now, the Obama administration and the sort of policy leads inside were very clear about trying to make this about violent extremism writ large. So they wanted to treat this as a phenomenon, that the same factors that go into making somebody join a white supremacist militia, a hate group, are the same things that will drive people to join a terrorist organization or become radicalized online. And there was a very strong push that said the best people to deal with this phenomenon are people on the ground. And so, to give everybody their due, there was a good faith effort by many people within the Obama administration to make this not exclusively about Muslims. However, the second that you attach community policing or profiling or engagement to security concerns, the second that happens, all right, and the security establishment gets involved, you immediately look at a community through the lens of a security problem only, okay? And all of a sudden, when you invite DHS or the Department of Defense to the Department of Defense to the table, to the Department of State on the table, the question is terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Who are the terrorists? Muslims. And so frankly, Obama opened up this space, but quickly lost ground in that space. And this is a kind of macro overview, right? Quickly lost ground in that space. And so the agenda did become about policing Muslims, monitoring Muslims. So the pilot projects that were sought out to sort of model what CVE policy and programming might look like took place in Minneapolis with a Somali community, took place in Boston because of the Boston Marathon bombing, and took place in Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, the community leads there were the Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development out of the mayor's office, and all of these were sort of partnered with municipalities, police, law enforcement, etc. And what ended up happening is that the conversation just trickled down to focus on how do we intervene on online extremism, online radicalization, mental health problems, and the target community was Muslims. Even though they would say, out of one mouth, it's about violent extremism writ large, the practical programming was always about Muslims. And so if you look at the awardees that were granted the original DHS grants, and this is, in my mind, it's a distraction because the DHS grants were very small compared to the overall policy agenda. But if you look at the grantees, something like 75% of them were dealing with Muslim populations, all right? And they were dealing with sort of mental health interventions for Muslim populations, but that presumes that the entire swath of Muslim youth in America are automatically disposed and vulnerable. It's sort of like saying black kids are just going to be violent and might join a gang. Instead of looking at the problem from a multifaceted view and looking at it from a ground-up perspective and asking community members how they deal with this sort of thing, the federal policy came in to try to orchestrate and manufacture what this community engagement might look like. And it relied upon massive stereotypes, bad science, a lot of bad science, by the way. And as a professor who knows many of these people who engaged in this so-called analysis, I can confidently say that all of the studies around countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism, all of them are a cottage industry fueled by the same defense apparatus that is funding the programming. And I can show you the journals, I can show you the grants, I can show you the professor's lines. It is a cottage industry, it's fake science. And so what's basically happened is that you've created a false problem and then created really bad solutions to this false problem. And I will tell you this, this isn't necessarily a off-the-record conversation, but the conversations we had with the stakeholders were off the record, so I won't tell you who told me this, but the FBI field officers who were in charge of implementing some of these countering violent extremism programs and some of the municipalities that we met with, they themselves told us in these closed-door dialogues, we have no idea what this policy is about. This came out of DC, it doesn't make sense, but we're just going through the motions. There is actually no consensus at the federal level between agencies about what constitutes the definition of violent extremism, about what they're looking at, or what best strategies might be. And I can tell you this as recent as last week that we did debriefings across the city with different government agencies and think tanks. And so it's a manufactured problem linked to the phenomena of the perception of an existential threat from terrorism. It is that fear, that perception, that's fueling all of this. And that entire policy framework has come to that. Now, the real problem is when it gets instituted in policing departments around the country, and that's what the coalition in Los Angeles has sought to stop. However, there are still those linkages, and I would just say that the growing relationship between local municipality police departments and the Department of Defense is a line that's been blurred over the last 10 years or so. I don't know if anybody's following that, but that's a very serious concern that many advocates on the ground have. CVE just folds right into that, so that's kind of a mouthful. But
so with that, we're going to stick around for the next 20 minutes and drink some coffee and carb load and get some sugar. So I'd invite you to all to join us. If you have any other questions, we're going to be around here for that. Just one housekeeping announcement. On October 19th and 20th, CAIR is having its National Policy and Leadership Conference. Muslim civil rights activists and leaders from across the country will be there with a lot of other Muslim youth and activists. Anyone in this room or congressional office who wants to attend, I'll give you a comp ticket. So just, you all have my email, that's how you got here. Please email me and I'll make sure you get in for free. Likewise for our banquet on October 20th, that's a Saturday. If you want to go and just see who the awardees are, meet with other Muslim community leaders, ping me and we'll make it happen.
And I have a question. Do we clap for briefings for the panelists?
I would love to.